Hey, you ever feel like you're trying to piece together a puzzle with a million tiny pieces?
Mm-hmm.
Especially, when it comes to stuff happening in Washington. You just want the key picture.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
the essentials.
Well, that's kind of what we're doing today. We're taking a good look at what's going on with President Trump and his efforts to get House Republicans on the same page with a budget plan.
Exactly. Now, budget talk might sound a bit dry, I know,
Yeah, definitely can.
but think of it like this. It's the blueprint, right? For what the government wants to do and how they plan to pay for it.
Okay.
And for President Trump, getting this budget plan locked down is really, really important
Why is that?
because it's the path, essentially, to making his tax cuts stick around and pushing forward with a lot of his other big goals. It's kind of the engine for his agenda, you could say.
Right. The engine.
Yeah.
Makes sense. But wouldn't you know it, things are never quite straightforward, are they?
Huh. Rarely.
It seems there's some pretty significant disagreement bubbling up within the Republican Party itself, which is throwing a bit of a curveball into the whole process.
A major curveball. Yeah.
So what we're going to do today is really dig into this internal debate, try to figure out what the different viewpoints are, and ultimately what it all could mean down the road.
Sounds good.
So where do we even start with this? It feels big.
Well, I think the core of the issue, it really boils down to two really different ideas about how the government's finances should look.
Okay, two visions.
Yeah. We've got the budget proposals coming out of the House and the Senate. And when you compare them, they're not just slightly different.
No.
They're worlds apart, honestly, especially when it comes to how much they want to cut spending.
Worlds apart is right. I saw the numbers. The Senate's idea is to cut around, what, $4 billion?
Around that, yeah.
Now, $4 billion is a lot of money, don't get me wrong.
Of course.
But then you look at what the House was aiming for, something like $1.5 trillion in cuts.
Yeah. Trillion with a T.
That's just a truly massive difference in scale. It really puts a spotlight on these fundamental disagreements we're seeing within the party, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And here's a key point. The Senate has actually already given the thumbs up to their version.
Oh, they passed it. Okay.
They adopted it. So now all eyes are on the House. They're the ones facing the pressure to consider and, potentially agree to this Senate-backed plan.
Which brings us to President Trump's role in all of this. He's not just watching from the sidelines, is he?
Oh, not at all.
It sounds like he's been very directly involved, trying to rally support for the Senate's budget plan among those House Republicans.
Absolutely. He's been actively trying to bring those hesitant House Republicans on board.
How so?
Well, there were reports of him sitting down with some of these GOP holdouts at the White House.
Okay, direct meetings.
And then at a fundraiser for House Republicans, he even told them to, get this, close your eyes and get there.
Wow. Close your eyes and get there.
Yeah.
Quite the pep talk.
Yeah. It sounds like he's really trying to push them, just get in line and vote yes.
And he didn't stop there, did he? I heard he also pointed out how Democrats tend to vote together.
He did. And he urged the Republicans to damn vote, basically saying, look, individual lawmakers might not get everything they want perfectly.
Right, compromise.
But they need to come together as a team. That was the message.
And if we step back and look at the bigger picture here, President Trump is clearly positioning this as like a really important step towards future success.
Definitely. He's predicting a massive victory in the 2026 midterm elections if Republicans can get this budget resolution passed and get his broader agenda moving.
A massive victory.
He's even suggesting they could pick up a significant number of seats in the House.
Which is a pretty optimistic outlook, isn't it? Considering how often the party holding the White House tends to lose seats in those midterm elections.
It is optimistic, yeah. But he's definitely painting a picture of potential wins.
While also hinting at what could happen if they don't get on board.
Exactly. He mentioned stupidity and people just grandstanding if they don't support it.
Grandstanding.
And even joked about maybe crying in their faces.
Okay, that's intense.
That's a very direct and forceful way of communicating his position, for sure.
And it wasn't just private meetings and speeches. He also took to social media, right?
On Wednesday morning, just as the House Rules Committee was getting ready to talk about the budget,
Timing.
he posted on Truth Social urging Republicans to pass what he called the One Big Beautiful Bill,
All gaps again.
all caps, and promised that the USA would soar like never before.
So, okay, you've got the president really leaning hard on these House Republicans to support this Senate budget plan.
Yeah, intense pressure.
But why are some of them digging in their heels so much? What's the main reason for their resistance?
Well, the main sticking point, it really comes down to those proposed spending cuts, or maybe I should say the lack of spending cuts in the Senate's proposal, at least in their view.
The lack of cuts?
As we mentioned earlier, the Senate is talking about around $4 billion in cuts,
Right.
while the House had been aiming for something closer to $1.5 trillion.
Huge difference.
So for a lot of the more fiscally conservative members in the House, that $4 billion figure it doesn't go nearly far enough. They see it as like a drop in the bucket.
Right. We heard some pretty strong reactions.
Yeah.
For instance, Representative Eric Burleson, he didn't mince words.
No, he didn't.
He called the Senate's proposed cuts anemic, even a joke.
Yeah, strong language.
And he stated pretty clearly that there's no way the House is going to adopt it as it stands right now.
Did he leave any wiggle room?
Well, he did suggest he might be open to being convinced if there was some solid guarantee of more significant cuts from the Senate down the line, but he definitely sounded very skeptical.
Okay, skeptical, but maybe persuadable. And he's not the only one feeling that way, is he?
No, Representative Eli Crane expressed similar doubts. When he was asked if promises from the president about future spending cuts would sway him, he said he'd need to, quote, see some product from the Senate that actually shows that they're serious about cutting.
See some product. Wants proof, not promises.
Exactly. He even dismissed the pressure coming from House GOP leadership as nonsense.
Wow, nonsense. That really shows a level of defiance towards the party line on this, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
And we also got a peek into these concerns during a House Rules Committee hearing.
Ah, yes. What happened there?
Well, even the chairman of the House Budget Committee, Jody Arrington.
The chairman himself.
Yeah. He admitted to having concerns about the Senate's resolution guiding the budget process, and he wouldn't even commit to voting in favor of it.
That's pretty telling, isn't it? When the person in charge of your budget in the House is hesitant to actually support the plan.
Very telling.
Absolutely. And then you had Representative Chip Roy, who was very, very clear in his opposition.
What does he say?
He stated flatly that the math still doesn't math.
Okay, direct?
A pretty direct way of saying the numbers don't add up for him. His main issue was that he sees the Senate budget as being all tax cuts and no spending cuts.
All tax cuts, no spending cuts. That's his view.
That's his view. He emphasized that he doesn't trust any promises from the Senate to cut spending later on. He basically demanded to see the detailed plan, saying, come, show me the math.
Show me the numbers.
Right. His bottom line was very firm. I will not vote for this bill because it is not responsible. That's a pretty strong stance to take.
Definitely. So, okay, we've got this significant internal disagreement within the Republican Party, clear divide there. But let's step back for a moment. Why is this particular budget resolution so important for President Trump's overall agenda? What makes this specific vote so crucial?
Okay, yeah, good question. This all boils down to something called the reconciliation process.
Reconciliation. Heard that term.
Right. Now, normally in the Senate, most pieces of legislation need 60 votes to move forward and actually pass.
The filibuster threshold.
Exactly. And that can be a really high bar to clear, especially when the political parties are pretty evenly divided, like they often are.
Sure.
However, the reconciliation process is, well, it's a special set of rules that applies to certain types of legislation, mainly those dealing with the budget.
Ah, okay. Special rules for budget stuff.
And it allows these bills to bypass that 60-vote requirement and pass with just a simple majority, just 51 votes if everyone is present and voting.
Okay, so it's like a special lane or a shortcut, basically.
Yeah.
It avoids potential roadblocks like the filibuster in the Senate.
That's a good way to put it, a shortcut.
So this means if the Republicans can get this budget resolution through, they wouldn't need any support from the Democrats to pass legislation that aligns with President Trump's priorities.
Exactly. 0 Democratic votes needed if they stick together. It's a really powerful tool that allows the majority party to move forward on key parts of their agenda without having to negotiate or compromise with the minority party.
Makes sense why it's so important then.
And in this particular case, one of the major goals tied to this budget resolution is the extension of the Trump tax cuts.
Right, the 2017 tax cuts.
Which are currently scheduled to expire, remember.
Ah, the tax cuts. Okay, that brings us to this concept of budget scoring, which sounds a little complicated.
It can be, yeah.
But seems to be at the heart of some of this disagreement as well. Can you break down what budget scoring is and why it's causing friction here?
Sure. So budget scoring is basically just how the government figures out and estimates how much a proposed law will cost or save over a certain period of time, usually 10 years.
Okay, estimating the cost.
Right.
Yeah.
And there are different ways to do this, different assumptions you can make. One of the key differences here is whether you use what's called a current policy baseline or a current law baseline.
Okay, current policy versus current law. What's the difference between those two?
Think of it this way. Current law is like saying, what does the law currently say will happen in the future?
What's written down?
What's written down? So when the Trump tax cuts were originally passed back in 2017, the law stated that they would expire at the end of this year.
Right, they have an end date.
So under a current law baseline, if you want to extend them, that action extending them would be seen as new spending or a reduction in revenue because the current law says they're going away. It changes the baseline.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, current policy takes a different approach. It basically assumes that current policies will continue even if the written law says they're supposed to end. It kind of assumes inertia.
Huh. So if you're using a current policy baseline, extending the tax cuts isn't really seen as creating new costs because the assumption is they were kind of going to continue anyway.
Precisely. And that's the approach that the Senate plan has taken. They're using this current policy baseline.
The Senate is using current policy.
Which means that the estimated $3.8 trillion cost of extending the Trump tax cuts, it doesn't actually show up as new spending or lost revenue in their budget projections in the same way.
It just vanishes.
Well, it's accounted for differently. It's as if they're saying, well, we expect these to continue, so extending them isn't really a change from expected policy.
But the House plan and the original way the 2017 tax cuts were scored back then used the current law baseline, right?
Yeah, correct.
Where that $3.8 trillion extension is counted as new spending or less revenue.
Yes, it shows up starkly on the ledger that way.
So the fiscal conservatives in the House are basically saying that the Senate's approach is, what, a bit of a gimmick? A way to avoid acknowledging the real cost of extending those tax cuts.
That's a fair way to characterize their view, yeah. They see the Senate's current policy approach as prioritizing the extension of tax cuts without really being upfront about the long-term impact on the national debt.
Because it makes the price tag look smaller.
Effectively, yes. They argue that by using the current policy baseline, the Senate isn't being fully honest about the true fiscal consequences. They want to see actual concrete cuts in spending alongside any extension of the tax cuts.
Right.
For them, it's about fiscal responsibility and not just adding potentially trillions more to the deficit without offsetting cuts.
So let's just recap quickly. We've got President Trump really pushing for this Senate budget plan.
Very hard push.
But a significant chunk of his own party in the House has some serious reservations.
Has reservations.
Mainly because they don't think it cuts nearly enough spending.
That's the crux of it for them.
This budget plan is really important because it unlocks that special reconciliation process in the Senate.
The key mechanism.
That could allow Republicans to extend the Trump tax cuts without needing any Democratic votes. However, there are major disagreements over how to account for the cost of extending those tax cuts, this whole scoring issue, and whether the proposed spending cuts are substantial enough.
Exactly. You've nailed the core tension. You've got this real conflict between the president's urgency to move forward with his agenda, particularly keeping those tax cuts in place.
Get it done now.
And a pretty vocal group within the House Republican Party that's focused laser-like on getting more significant action on reducing government spending. It really highlights the different priorities and, frankly, philosophies within the party itself.
It really does. This whole situation really makes you think, doesn't it, about what the long-term effects of these different approaches to the budget could actually be.
Absolutely.
You know, will the president's influence be enough to bridge this divide within the Republican Party? Or will the fiscal hawks hold the line?
That's the billion or maybe trillion-dollar question right now.
Right. And what does this internal struggle really tell us about the challenges of governing, even when you have a slim majority in Congress? It's not always easy herding cats, is it?
Definitely not. It gives you a lot to consider when you think about how the budget process works or sometimes doesn't work, and what it means for the future direction of the country's finances.
It certainly raises some important questions about what different factions within a party prioritize, and the strategies they're willing to employ, or maybe block, to achieve their goals.
The debate over spending cuts versus tax cuts is a long-standing one. We know that.
Decades old.
And this situation really brings those differing viewpoints into sharp focus again. It will be really interesting to see how this ultimately plays out.
Yeah, definitely one to watch. Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you all a clearer picture of what's going on with this complex budget debate.
Hope so.
It's a good reminder that even seemingly straightforward goals, like passing a budget, can get really complicated when you dive into the details of policy and the different perspectives within a political party.
Always more complicated than it looks on the surface.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us today on The Deep Dive.